The clock over the trauma bay stuttered between 4:59 and 5, as if it feared the honesty of morning. Night in the emergency room is a long exhale of alarms and fluorescent hum, a tide that never fully retreats. I had been on my feet since sunset, stitching the small violences of the city back into skin and spirit when the double doors coughed out the sound that splits the room in two, gurney wheels racing like sparks on wet concrete, the paramedics' cadence already halfway through the report. The boy on the stretcher was almost 17 in the way a sapling is almost a tree, broad-shouldered, barefoot, a smear of blood at the hairline, the kind of blood that doesn't know it belongs to a future. The EMT's words tumbled over each other. Single vehicle rollover, entrapment, lost vitals and won again. A mother somewhere behind them in a separate rig with contractions too early for dawn. We cut clothes, pressed gauze, drew lines, and the room found the choreography that keeps panic from breaking the floor. Someone calling meds in milligrams, someone counting ribs, someone asking me for hands I did not know I still had to give. There is a quiet inside every siren, a pocket of stillness where the body remembers how to be a body. I saw it when the boy's chest rose against the bag valve mask. A rebellion of breath. He wore a string bracelet woven by fingers that loved him, a clumsy braid of red and black. I tucked it beneath tape so it wouldn't be lost in the cyclone of interventions and whispered the kind of promise I'd learned to make only to myself. Not to the boy, not to the room, but to the thin space between the two where outcomes soften before they harden. Beside us, Curtain 3 held a man with a paper cup of midnight, coffee cooling toward confession. He had walked in with chest pressure and a history of pride. He pretended to be unafraid, the way a storm cloud pretends it is just weather. His chart said 58. His eyes said he had run out of bridges to burn and was ready to build the last one back to shore. The attending arrived with the sunrise cracking along the seam of the blinds. We moved as if we could outrun what was chasing the boy. When you work under this light long enough, you become a student of signs, pupils that do not negotiate, a heart that argues with itself in jagged rhythms, the peculiar blue that creeps into fingernails when oxygen has left the room to make a phone call no one wants to answer. I focused on what could be held, the warm curve of a shoulder under sterile drape, the red-black bracelet that would not let me forget there were birthdays he had already celebrated, and some that he had not. Somewhere down the hall, a fetal monitor tried to write a lullaby it did not know how to finish. Time thinned to a wire. The boy's blood pressure learned the grammar of gravity. We hung another unit and asked the monitor to tell a better story. When the intercom cracked with code blue for Curtain 3, the whole ER pivoted as if pulled by a single string. The man with the midnight coffee had folded into himself like a note slipped under a door. Two crises are not more dramatic than one. They are simply proof that suffering is impolite and refuses to queue. I split my breath into pieces and gave one to each room. In trauma, the boys' numbers steadied just enough to pretend they might stay. In Curtain 3, the man's pulse stumbled like a drunk apology, then rallied, then vanished. You learn quickly that most miracles look like paperwork afterward, but in their making they sound like a choir of hands. We shocked once, then twice. He returned with the wet, angry gasp of someone dragged rudely from sleep. When he blinked at me, I said nothing aloud, only placed a palm on the rough shore of his wrist and felt a tide come back in. By 6:03 the ER had made itself into a map of new decisions. The boy needed a surgeon who was not yet dressed and a CT scan that would admit no delay. The man needed a room upstairs and a conversation that would not fit on the lines of a discharge summary. Dawn pressed its forehead against the glass doors, and I remembered the way my mother would wake me on school days, soft, relentless, telling me to meet the day even when it was raining. I wondered if the boy's mother had taught him the same, if she was counting contractions in the back of a second ambulance and bargaining with every deity she had ever believed in. As the transport techs unclipped the gurney and the elevator swallowed the boy whole, I slipped the bracelet free, took its measure in my palm, and returned it to his wrist with a tenderness that felt like a secret. In the ER, you do not say you are afraid. You become fluent in tasks and you hope the tasks can translate into mercy. There are hours in the hospital that roar without raising their voice. The early morning after a hard night is one of them, full of paperwork that smells like the storm it survived. The boy was in radiology, then surgery, and the monitor at the nurse's station wore his room number like a worry bead. In holding, curtain 4 hummed with the small busy agonies of a woman in preterm labor. I kept moving so that none of the fear inside me had to choose a chair. Movement can be an alibi. If my hands are full, perhaps my heart cannot be questioned. A custodian squeegeed the memory of blood from the trauma floor and nodded at me the way people do when language costs too much. The man from curtain 3 had a bed on telemetry and a wife on the way. He was already practicing survival with the stubbornness of a man who once believed he was immortal and had learned otherwise before breakfast. When the boy's mother arrived, the ER doors recognized her the way a harbor recognizes a returning ship. By the way it lists with cargo, it cannot set down. She was small and brave and already breaking. Her hair was pulled into a knot designed to hold back more than hair. She asked for him, and the clerk said the surgical floor, and then her breath tightened into a fist when another contraction wrapped around her spine. She stood still in the waiting room and negotiated with pain like a diplomat with limited time. I walked her to a chair that could not possibly be enough. There is no furniture gracious enough for this kind of grief. I told her the facts I could tell, which is to say not the ones she wanted. Stable for the moment. In good hands. In surgery now. I told her we would call upstairs and I did, and they told me to tell her to breathe, and I relayed the message as if I had invented the concept. Hospitals are cities with complicated weather. In one hallway, a joke lands and heals something that medicine cannot reach. In another, a silence becomes a cathedral where people come to lay down what they cannot carry out. The boy's mother stared at the fish tank with a concentration that should have granted her a diploma. Her hands folded and unfolded into the shape of prayer, then into the shape of rage, then into something like surrender. I brought water. I brought the thin blanket we offer to people as though warmth could negotiate with dread. I told her about the string bracelet, how it was still on his wrist, and she smiled in a way that made the word victory seem possible in languages I have never spoken. By 8 o'clock, the night shift handed the ER to the day with clipped sentences and the hunger of people who have forgotten what it's like to be horizontal. I stayed on overtime because sometimes the story keeps you even when the clock tells you you can leave it. Upstairs, the surgical team was inside the boy's abdomen counting the cost of metal and speed. Downstairs, the pregnant mother refolded her fear into smaller squares each time the elevator blinked without her son in it. I thought of my own first night in this ER, more than a decade ago, when an elder nurse showed me how to tie a tourniquet and how not to tie myself in knots. She had said the secret aloud, that we are not heroes, only witnesses with training. And that witnessing well is a kind of medicine too. When the call finally came, it arrived first in the eyes of the charge nurse who answered it. There is a color grief paints on the face before the mouth finds the words. The elevator opened on the surgical team. At the same time the phone said, what elevators cannot. The boy was alive. The bleeding had been persuaded, not conquered. The liver was torn, but reparable. There would be tubes and days of numbers that pretended to be destiny. And yet, alive. The mother's shoulders fell an inch, which is to say a mile. She asked whether she could see him, and we said soon, and the word became a raft in flood water. I walked back to curtain 3 to check on the telemetry transfer and found the man's wife counting change in her purse as though money could buy back the minutes she'd almost lost. She asked me what had happened, and I told her in the past tense because the present is too delicate. She nodded and said she had been waiting for a catastrophe because you cannot defy your body forever. Sometimes, in these halls, strangers invite you into the truest rooms of their lives, show you the photographs they keep hidden in their ribcage, and ask you to hold one with them for a second. I held it. I told her he had come back angry, which is another way of saying he wanted to stay. Outside, The sky decided it was morning in earnest. Inside, the day brewed a new list of reasons to stay humble. The boy's mother was wheeled upstairs to obstetrics when her contractions began to measure themselves with a ruler that demanded attention. I watched the elevator numbers climb, thinking of a child fighting to stay and a child insisting on arriving, siblings in a way that would defy family trees. The ER settled into its noon rhythm, lacerations that could be persuaded to meet again, fevers that forced us to negotiate with mystery, heartbreaks disguised as indigestion, and indigestion disguised as heartbreak. The string bracelet had imprinted its braid into my palm. I could still feel it when I washed my hands. Every emergency room has a minute that redeems or ruins a month. Ours arrived at 12:41, when an alarm from upstairs became a sprint and then a decision that might as well have been lightning. The boy's blood pressure fell through a trapdoor. A clot dislodged like a stone in a stream that suddenly remembers it can move. On obstetrics, the mother's labor accelerated into a wild mercy. 2 floors apart, survival decided to speak in chords. I rode the elevator with a transport nurse who kept his jaw set like a vow. We entered the surgical ICU and found a room humming with the intensity of a courtroom during a verdict. Monitors threw out their bright hieroglyphs. The anesthesiologist's voice carved a path through the noise, and we followed it with our hands. There is a ritual to emergency that feels almost ancient. The drape lifted, the instruments named, the count repeated until it becomes a spell. Under it all, a boy's body argued for itself with the stubbornness of spring. We hung blood and told the heart it was not allowed to stop having opinions. The surgeon's eyes narrowed to the size of a possibility. In the longest minute, the bleeding slowed, then sulked, then agreed to behave. I have never believed in guarantees. I believe in the way a pulse under your fingers can become a poem. When the line stabilized, a post-it note fell out of the chart and stuck to my shoe. It was crumpled, written in the broad strokes of youth. A to-do list made the day before perhaps, or the week folded into the ritual of pockets. Fix brakes. Text Danny back. Pick up mom's shift if she's tired. The ordinary audacity of those lines struck me harder than the alarms. The future had errands. It still wanted him. Downstairs, my phone buzzed with a message from obstetrics. A healthy cry had braided itself into the air like a ribbon. The mother had delivered a daughter who announced herself with protest and promise. I imagined the moment. A new person held against a body that had spent all its courage, the two of them listening for a heartbeat that the nurses would tell them was not in the room but was elsewhere, refusing and then consenting to continue. The mother asked for news of her son and was told the last true thing we had. That he was fighting, and that he had joined the fight late but was not a poor student. In the afternoon, the man from Curtain 3 called downstairs from telemetry and asked if he might speak to me before the day forgot him. I found 10 minutes, which is to say I stole them from tasks that could be forgiven. He wanted me to know that in the moment when his heart quit, he had thought not of his job or his house but of the pond where he had taught his daughter to skip stones. He said he had been unkind to his body because he believed it would always forgive him. He said he would like to write a promise to it and asked whether bodies listened when we apologized. I told him they do. Not because I had science to prove it, but because I had watched bodies respond to tenderness like fields respond to rain. He asked about the boy, a stranger he had never met, and I told him the truth with care, like a fragile package. That the boy was still here, and sometimes here is the bravest word. Evening thinned the light into long questions. The ICU settled into the hush that follows a trial. I stood at the window of the boy's room and counted the machines as if they were cousins at a family reunion. His face, freed of blood and bravado, looked younger than the bracelet had promised. He was intubated, medicated, alchemized into a version of himself that did not require him to perform anything except survival. I brushed a strand of hair from his forehead the way my mother had done for me in fevers that felt like worlds. I told him with my hands that the world was holding its breath with him. Sometimes, the only prayer available is contact. By the second morning, the ER had already assigned the story to one of the drawers where we keep what we can't carry daily. But the hospital is a single organism. What happens in one wing makes the others shiver. Obstetrics sent down a photograph, Polaroid bright, of the mother with her newborn daughter, both flushed with the hard-earned right to rest. She held the picture like a passport when she came to the ICU in a wheelchair, her eyes searching for an anchor in the sea of tubing and beeps. I stepped aside to let love do whatever work it had planned. She spoke softly to the boy, telling him things a room cannot comprehend but a body can, about the way his sister's hair curled damp against her temple, about the way morning had arrived even though it had no invitation, about the football game he had been excited about this weekend, the lineup he had posted on a wall I had never seen. She told him the world was not finished with him. Her hand rested on his forearm, near the bracelet, and the monitors found a steadier rhythm as if they recognized the accent of home. Later, I brought the man from Curtain 3 a handout on cardiac rehab and watched as he traced the steps like a map back to himself. He said he had called his daughter to ask if she might like to visit the pond again when he was discharged. He said he had stopped adding sugar to his coffee that morning and had discovered it still tasted like a beginning. Survival changed his posture, not his personality. He was still stubborn, still proud, but his pride had found a better hill to die on. He asked whether he could bring something to the boy's family, soup or silence, and I told him that both were useful in the right amounts. The hospital has a way of teaching generosity without preaching it. On my break, I sat on the back steps with the cigarette smokers and breathed their smoke like incense. Not because I wanted it, but because rituals share space. One of the medics who had brought the boy in sat beside me. He said the car had whispered its own autopsy at the scene, that the guardrail had been unkind but honest, that the moon had watched but offered no testimony. He said he had been a father for 3 months, and that every teen he transported now arrived with his son's face superimposed. He said he was tired of being the courier of catastrophes and wondered aloud what else he might be if not that. I told him he was already something else, a man resisting despair, which is honorable work. When I returned to the ICU, the surgeon met me at the door with the posture of cautious good news. The boy would breathe on his own soon if the numbers stayed obedient. The liver had accepted its sutures. The brain scan read like a poem without the last line, open to interpretation, but trending toward the kind that ends with breath. We lightened sedation. We invited his body to remember the habit of waking. He did not open his eyes that day, but his fingers found the rail and curled around it like a climber testing the next hold. It felt extravagant to imagine what he might say when sound was allowed back into his mouth, but extravagance is permitted in small doses here, like sugar on holidays. The mother asked me how to say thank you to people when thank you is not enough. I told her about small mercies, about the custodian who had made the floor shine where her son had bled, about the lab tech who had run a sample by hand, sprinting up 2 flights because the pneumatic tube had lost its nerve. About the clerk who had stayed 2 hours past her shift to argue with an insurance company until a bed became a right instead of a request. She listened as if gathering stones to build a small altar. She said she would remember names. I told her that remembering is a kind of medicine we give back. On the 3rd dawn, the boy woke. It happened without fanfare, the way seasons turn when you aren't looking. A ripple across a quiet lake. His eyes opened with the tentative curiosity of someone considering a second chance. He did not speak. His mouth was a history book still closed, but he saw the bracelet and moved his wrist toward it, and then he saw his mother, and all the machines dimmed into background as 2 people learned how to be a family again in a room that had spent days pretending to be a ship. He cried. She cried. The monitors tattled on their hearts, and the nurse pretending not to cry near the door failed admirably. He would live, not because we were heroic, but because 100 ordinary choices had conspired in his favor. Seatbelts and fast hands, training repeated until it sounded like instinct, blood in a refrigerator that had waited its whole cold life for this purpose. A surgeon who read the body's snowy static and found the broadcast underneath. A mother whose voice taught the monitors a better rhythm. a sister who arrived loudly to remind everyone how beginnings sound. The man from curtain 3 sent a note written carefully on a menu from the cafeteria, the back greasy with hope. He wrote that he had walked 3 laps without stopping and that he had begun to forgive himself in small installments due monthly. He asked the boy to consider guarding his heart like it belonged to a future he would meet. I read the note aloud at the bedside, translating the cadence of another man's second chance into a language this one's body might trust. Before discharge to the step-down unit, I stood with the mother by the window while the boy slept again. This time an honest sleep that had nothing to prove. She showed me a photo on her phone of him laughing with a dog who looked like loyalty with fur. She said he had been saving for a car, and we laughed at the cosmic humor no one had requested. She said she had named the baby after her own mother, who had believed that the world was kind even when evidence refused to corroborate. We agreed that sometimes kindness must be practiced in advance, like scales on a piano, so that when the music demands it, our fingers remember. A week later, I passed them in the lobby, mother with a stroller, son moving slower than pride would prefer, but moving. He wore the bracelet and a hoodie that failed to hide how thin he had become, but his eyes were a river learning its course again. He lifted a hand in the universal salute of people who have walked out of rooms they feared would keep them. I lifted mine back. No speech, no ceremony, just the quiet applause of breath shared under a ceiling that had listened to too many goodbyes. The ER that night returned to its usual curriculum, teaching patience to the impatient, dignity to the undignified moments, courage to those who had misplaced it. When the sirens sang, we went to meet them, because the job is not to judge the storm, but to open the door. I thought of the boys' list: fix brakes, text Danny, pick up mom's shift, and I wrote my own on a glove box torn open and used as paper. Offer water first, then answers. Call people by their names. See the person before the wound. Hold the line until morning does what morning does. If there is a moral here, it is not carved in marble. It is written daily in dry erase pen and wiped away to make room for the next. But it stays somehow, in the way hands learn to be ready. In the way strangers become a temporary family under relentless light. In the way survival is less a thunderclap than a series of patient taps on a locked door until someone inside remembers where the key is. Some stories end with triumph and trumpets. Ours ends with a boy who will go home slower than before, a mother who will sleep in 2-hour increments because love set its alarm, a man on telemetry who will throw away an old life like a shirt that never fit right, and a nurse who will go back to the triage desk to ask the next name, and the next. Happy? Yes, in the way that means honest. Sad? Yes, in the way that means alive. And if there is a lesson, it is this. In the emergency room, we do not control the endings, but we can curate the kindnesses that carry people toward them. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel so these human moments find you again. Tell me in the comments what part stayed with you, and if you have a story of your own, I'm listening.